Welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. On this week's episode, Freddie Hubbard, his life and times and best music. And on this hour, we are going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of the albums we are going to be talking about on this hour. The first one's called Hub Tones, released on Blue Note Records in 1963. This one's a standout album from Freddie's compilation. On this album, he's joined by Herbie Hancock on piano and James Spaulding on alto sax and flute. Breaking Point was released on Blue Note Records in 1964. This was an album full of groundbreaking trumpet melodies. Keystone Bop, Sunday Night, was released in 1981. This album's taken from a live performance by Hubbard and his band performed over 3 nights. One of Another Kind is an album compilation of 2 Freddie Hubbard albums that he performed in collaboration with Woody Shaw, another legendary trumpeter. Skydive, released in 1972. This one's Hubbard's 4th CTI recording and consists of a diverse compilation of songs, a compilation of classics and original compositions. And The Hub of Hubbard, released in 1970, was recorded during a tour in Germany. This album is a diverse compilation of songs and gives us an insight into Freddie Hubbard at his best in the bop genre. So that was a quick recap of everything that we're going to be discussing on this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. On this week's episode, Freddie Hubbard, his life and times and best albums. On this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first one's called Hub Tones. It was released in Blue Note Records in 1963. This one's another standout album from Freddie's compilation. Spaulding's saxophone and flute combination is a deviation from the typical hard bop trumpet and tenor saxophone playing that was typical of Blue Note recordings at the time. Breaking Point was released on Blue Note Records in 1964. This one's an unusual album for Freddie Hubbard. It consists of a different style than most of his previous album releases. In this album, it's all about innovative, groundbreaking trumpet melodies. Keystone Bop, Sunday Night, was released on Prestige Records in 1981. This album's taken from a live performance by Hubbard and his band performed over 3 nights. The band consists of Hubbard, Joe Henderson and Bobby Hutcherson. The actual album wasn't released until much later in 1996. And there's a lot of strong performances in the tracks. All the musicians are in top form. One of Another Kind, Live at Keystone Corner, is an album compilation of 2 Freddie Hubbard albums that he performed in collaboration with Woody Shaw, another legendary trumpeter. The albums Double Take and Eternal Triangle. Skydive, released in 1972. This one's Hubbard's 4th CTI recording and consists of a diverse compilation of songs. There's 2 of his own compositions here, Jam Tunes, Povo and Skydive. Another highlight, the way he covers the theme song from The Godfather. There's also a beautiful rendition of Bixby DeBecker's In a Mix. Hubbard also plays several trumpet solos, and he's supported by a star cast of instrumentalists on brass and woodwinds from George Benson to Keith Jarrett. The Hub of Hubbard was released in 1970. This was another series of melodies on the MPS label. And this album's taken from what many critics call his golden era of album releases. It came on top of other albums like Straight Life, Red Clay and First Light. The album was recorded during a tour in Germany. It combines old jazz classics covered in innovative new styles. The opening track, Without a Song, is a fast-paced melody featuring drums, piano, bass and trumpet. Just one of those things, an energetic bop song with a lot of cymbal playing. There's a comparatively slow, long-drawn melody called Blues for Dwayne, an original composition by Hubbard. And the album ends on a dreamy note, a dreamy ballad called The Things We Did Last Summer, a piano and trumpet duet. So this album is a diverse compilation of songs and gives us an insight into Freddie Hubbard at his best in the bop genre. So that was some insight into more of Freddie Hubbard's best albums of all time, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. On this week's episode, Freddie Hubbard, his life and times and best albums. Now for some trending album news. There's a new album release called You Are Here by multi-instrumentalist Miles Cochran. It's a beautiful album featuring a variety of instruments and emotions. One of the tracks from the album, Make Something Out of Nothing, was featured on the Best New Music CD on Uncut magazine. Miles is a veteran artist who's developed a unique style of twang, jazz, folk and chamber music. And this album, You Are Here, is in like form. It's both ethereal and contemporary. The album features groovy guitar music, dynamic bass, and soaring cellos in a backdrop of electronic guitar music. The standout feature of the music is the atmosphere. Miles himself describes this album as ambient Americana. The mood is overall nostalgic, gentle, and spirited and dynamic at the same time. For more information, please visit www.milescochran.com. And that was some trending album news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Freddie Hubbard's best albums of all time. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, Freddie Hubbard, his life and times and best hits. And on this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. The first album is called Blue Spirits, released in 1965. This is probably Hubbard's most famous album of all time. It's an adventurous album, blending a mix of styles. It also showcases Hubbard's prowess both as a bandleader and composer. Without a Song Live in Europe was released in 1969, another fascinating compilation of live performances by Hubbard. In this album, Hubbard's bringing a unique style to conventional jazz standards. Backlash was released in 1967. This album's another one that combines avant-garde and hard bop. The band was an all-star one and there's plenty of exciting moments on the set list. Hubcap was released in 1961. This was an album full of traditional hard bop themes. And Going Up, released in 1961, one of Hubbard's best albums for Blue Note Records, featuring some outstanding solos and emotional ballads. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, Freddie Hubbard, his life and times and best hits. And on this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. The first album is called Blue Spirits. It was released in 1965. This is probably Hubbard's most famous album of all time. There are surging songs, emotional ballads, mostly original compositions. There's Hubbard collaborating with James Spaulding, James Henderson, and Hank Mobley. Some of the highlights on this album: Soft Surge, a surging blues track. Hubbard's trumpet playing is fiery and emotional, interjected by Henderson's saxophone playing. The piano track is a gospel-themed one. Very moody, atmospheric track, the title track Blue Spirits. The standout feature of this track is Spaulding's haunting flute melodies. Outer Forces is an emotional roller coaster. Hubbard's trumpet playing is dynamic and powerful, accentuated by Mayburn's piano playing. So this album is basically a blend of avant-garde and hard bop jazz. Hubbard's original compositions are mainly themed with traditional blues but are also innovative and creative. Blue Spirits was a hit right off the bat, an adventurous album blending a mix of styles. Also showcases Hubbard's prowess both as a bandleader and composer. It's one of the timeless jazz albums in the hallmark of jazz. Without a Song Live in Europe was released in 1969, another fascinating compilation of live performances by Hubbard. He's on trumpet, supplemented by Roland Hanna, Ron Carter, and Louis Hayes on piano, bass, and drums. This album, Hubbard's bringing a unique style to conventional jazz standards. The title track plays out as a blend of new themes. There's also wistful ballads like The Things We Did Last Summer and Body and Soul. Backlash was released in 1967. This album is another one that combines avant-garde and hard bop. It was one of his 3 albums released on Atlantic Records. There are 6 tracks on this album, and Hubbard's group, featuring Joe Henderson, Bob Cunningham, and Otis Ray and others, does a wonderful job, especially on the tracks Little Sunflower, which was Freddie's debut song, and Up Jumped Spring. They were a great team, and there's plenty of exciting moments on the set list. Hubcap was released in 1961. This was an album full of traditional hard bop themes. In this album, Hubbard was still in his early years developing his own style, and there's a mix-up of classics and original compositions on this album, all very energetically performed. Going Up was released in 1961. This one's one of Hubbard's best albums for Blue Note Records. He is joined here by saxophonist Hank Mobley, pianist McCoy Tyner, bassist Paul Chambers, and drummer Philly Joe Jones. There's some outstanding solos and emotional ballads on this album. An excellent hard bop compilation. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, Freddie Hubbard, his life and times and best hits. We've come to an end of today's episode of the Jazz Update, so now let's recap what we were talking about on today's program. Freddie Hubbard was an outstanding hard bop trumpeter of his time. His solos were innovative, his trumpet playing was dynamic and soulful. He started out playing the trumpet in his hometown in Indianapolis. In 1958, he started touring New York, the epicenter of the jazz world. He then started collaborating with jazz icons like Philly Joe Jones, Sonny Rollins, and more. In 1960, he recorded his debut album, Open Sesame, to massive success. The album rocketed him to stardom. He reached his pinnacle in the 70s, where he recorded a string of hit albums for CTI Records like Red Clay, First Light, and Skydive. His playing was groundbreaking, blending a fusion of soul, jazz, and hard bop. His 1972 album First Light won him a Grammy. So that was a quick recap of his biography. Now let's talk about some of his best albums of all time. The first one's Open Sesame, released on Blue Note Records in 1960. This was Freddie Hubbard's debut album and showcased to the world his prowess as a jazz trumpeter for the very first time. First Light, released on CTI Records in 1971. This one was a showcase of how artistic Freddie Hubbard's playing was. One of the tracks in the album, First Light, won him a Grammy for Best Jazz Performance by a Group. Red Clay was released on CTI Records in 1970. In this album, Freddie's in a new genre. One of the standout tracks on the album is the title track, Red Clay. It went on to become one of Freddie's most popular hits. Blue Spirits, released in 1965. This is probably Hubbard's most famous album of all time, an adventurous one blending a mix of styles. It also showcases his prowess both as a band leader and composer. And Going Up, released in 1961, is one of Hubbard's best albums for Blue Note Records, featuring some outstanding solos and emotional ballads. So that was a quick insight into Freddie Hubbard, his life and times and best hits. And on that note, we've come to an end of today's episode of The Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. You can check out the archives of today's show on my YouTube channel, The Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan. And on that note, I'll see you again next week. Have a great week ahead.